Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 10 of the Africa-India Global Dialogue series that is brought to you by the African Union Development Agency and the Center for Social and Economic Progress in New Delhi. We are hosting the final webinar, the final episode of the series, so we're really excited. And the theme for today is Shared Histories, Emerging Futures, Africa and India in a Multipolar World. We're very excited to have with us Mr. David Rasquinha. He's the former Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of the Export-Import Bank of India. Post-retirement, he served for 4 years as a member of the Reserve Bank of India's Advisory Board on Banking and Financial Frauds. He's currently an independent director on the boards of several organizations. But a little bit of history, very interesting history. David joined the India EXIM Bank in 84-85, and since then he has had a wide-ranging exposure to the broad field of export credit. He has led the bank's cross-border development projects across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and led close to $10 billion of debt issuance. He has rich experience in domestic and international project financing, project structures and documentation, and he spearheaded the bank's flagship programs of bilateral economic diplomacy on behalf of the Government of India. Thank you so much for joining us, David. We're so thrilled to have you. We also have with us Fatma Ahmed, who is a program specialist with the UNDP's Regional Bureau for Africa. Her work focuses on governance, peace, and political transitions. She coordinates the Africa Facility to support inclusive transitions and supports the rollout of the Africa Transition Index. Fatima brings over 12 years of experience from both the private sector and the international development sector and has worked on a wide range of regional stakeholders and institutions across Africa. Her current focus is on advancing flagship initiatives under the new regional program, particularly in areas of AI, digital governance, and resource governance, to help strengthen Africa's capacity to respond to emerging challenges and opportunities. So this is wonderful for us because to wrap up, we have someone who's an expert on economic diplomacy and on development. But before I pose my opening questions to the both of you, Pamela, would you like to say a few opening remarks from our NEPAD?
Yes, great. Thank you so much, Vida. And good afternoon, everyone, colleagues and distinguished guests that are joining us on the call today. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to the episode 10, actually, being the 10th month of the year. We are on point in time of this Africa-India Global Dialogue series, co-hosted by the African Union Development Agency and the Center for Social and Economic Progress. Today's conversation on shared histories, emerging futures, Africa and India in a multipolar world really invites us to reflect on how these two regions bound by history, by values, and aspirations can shape a new global order rooted in mutual respect and opportunity. We meet at a moment when global geopolitics is undergoing profound transformation. The world is increasingly multipolar, with shifting centers of power, evolving alliances, and new forms of economic, technological interdependence. In this context, Africa and India stand not as peripheral actors, but as pivotal partners, and both regions bring demographic vitality, innovation, and a shared development ethos that can redefine South-South cooperation for the 21st century. From climate resilience and digital transformation to health systems, trade, as well as capacity building, both Africa and India's collaboration embodies the idea that sustainable growth must be inclusive, equitable, and regionally grounded. Through the African Policy Bridge Tank program at the African Union Development Agency, we aim to translate these insights into actionable knowledge by connecting dialogue to policy, as well as ensuring that this policy is implementable across our member states. The series is being an evolving platform of bringing scholars, policymakers, and foresight experts, and also, most importantly, by aligning our decisions with Agenda 2063's vision of the Africa we want, and India's own commitment to a rules-based cooperative international order. As we look ahead, I hope today's dialogue will deepen our understanding of how Africa and India can collectively navigate global shifts, amplify the global South's voice, as well as to craft a future defined not by dependency but by partnership. With that, I thank our speakers today, Dr. David Rasquinha, as well as Ms. Fatima Ahmed, and my co-moderator, Dr. Vida, on call. Thank you for joining this timely discussion on a forward-looking exchange that we will engage in. Thank you very much. Over to you, Vida.
Thank you, Pamela. David, first question to you. For those of us who are not aware, and those of our readers, because usually what happens is these dialogues are posted on YouTube, and we have viewership from across the world. So for those folks who don't know, what is the role of the Indian EXIM Bank when it comes to India's economic diplomacy in Africa?
Yeah, thanks, Veda. Can we go back actually to 2003-04 when the Indian economic diplomacy really started? If you look at it, it was Mr. Jaswant Singh, the then finance minister, who in his budget speech on February 29th, probably 2004, he made a statement which I think has been overlooked by history. He said that India's days of accepting aid from a number of countries were over. India would henceforward accept tied aid only from 5 countries in the EU. It would ask other countries, with all due gratitude, to route their aid through institutions. He interestingly said that India would now become an aid donor and share its development experience with other countries, beginning by writing off the debt owed by about 7 HIPC countries. Now, I want to stress on this point. He said that India would share its development lessons. India was not going to be looking at preaching to people or telling them what to do or how they should do it. But India was going to say that, look, we've had this experience in our development course. We'd like to share it with you so that your learning curve can be a little less steep. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And we're happy to share with you the good and bad lessons that we've learned in our progress. So the economic diplomacy started with infrastructure projects in various countries around the world. Now, when you do infrastructure projects, you need a financial institution. You need an institution which understands project finance, which can muster and raise foreign currency resources, which can look at procurement and make sure that genuine price discovery is happening, which can monitor the progress of a project, identify problems, and prescribe solutions before the problems become intractable. These are not things which a government can do. A government officer, a bureaucrat, is well trained in diplomacy in other areas, but not in project financing. So this is where the EXIM Bank of India steps in. The EXIM Bank has the experience of cross-border projects in multiple areas of the globe. We've done project financing, we've done project structuring, we've done project monitoring. So it's a symbiotic relationship. The government obviously has the money, has the policy direction, has the ability to take decisions, and the EXIM Bank has the ability to implement those decisions in the best possible way. That's the best summary I can give you for your answer.
No, thank you, David. I think you also kind of tell us what was the beginning, at least what was the philosophical underpinnings of the shift in thought. And also, I guess, how India defines and understands development, right, in a way from its own experience and what it would like to share with other partners in the Global South. Fatima, this is an excellent segue to you because from UNDP's perspective, when you have actors and partners like India who are bringing a certain value proposition when it comes to developmental agendas to the table, what are the key focus areas and priorities for African governments?
Sure, no, it's an excellent question. And I think here first, before answering that, I think it's important to first set the stage, right? In terms of what is the current context that we're dealing with before bringing in how UNDP specifically sees priorities in Africa. So as Pamela said, we're currently globally seeing this shift in geopolitics. We're seeing a huge shrinkage in development financing as we know it. And to a degree, we're also seeing a shift where funding is increasing on military spending. A report shared that only 2.7 trillion was invested in military spending. So this is clearly showing that the development agenda is obviously under big questioning in terms of its relevance and its importance. Now, this is also happening in the backdrop of major UN reforms. So the United Nations obviously celebrated 80 years, and the UN General Assembly specifically was still a big multilateral convening ground, right, where we saw a big slogan of better together. So really pushing for multilateralism and working together. Now, how do these shifts affect Africa? So, of course, it affects us greatly. First of all, one of the key things that was featured at the UN General Assembly, and you saw this from countries like Nigeria, South Africa, Ethiopia, really calling for the demand of Security Council reform and representation. And also, we're seeing this as well in terms of deprioritization of Africa and being in these global stages, like the membership of the G20, right? And why this is particularly important in terms of the continent and what we're doing is there was a brilliant paper that was published recently called Financing the Africa We Want by Mo Ibrahim Forum. And 3 key core priority areas came out, clear steps for Africa to finance our future. The first was maximizing the continent's own domestic resources. Now, this is pivotal. We have a lot of domestic resources. How do we maximize what we have? And I think there's a lot of learning here from India as well in terms of drawing on lessons and shared histories. The second was monetizing the continent's vast natural resources. I know in this podcast there's been a lot of discussions around critical minerals, talking about not exporting and how do we increase the value chain, and also monetizing on the assets that we do have. So that's a clear, tangible way there for Africa. And the third was attracting more private capital. And here it would be great to learn from David's experience on how can Africa do that in this current climate. So in terms of looking at this context and then coming to UNDP, which is the organization I work for, there's a lot of opportunities. And these 3 priorities, UNDP being positioned across the continent in all 54 countries, we support in brokering some of these relationships between the private sector and the public. We work very closely with the African Union, regional economic communities, including our NEPAD, and looking to see how do we continue these partnerships? How do we also leverage our country offices to draw on experiences from India, from the support that the country office is providing there with some of the actors in Africa? And truly, I think the ethos is currently in the current climate is working together, learning from our shared histories, and seeing how we build mutually beneficial partnership. So I think there are many priorities, and the Agenda 2063 sets them out very clearly. And I know we're currently now in the second stage of the 10-year plan and accelerating the implementation plan of Agenda 2063. So the priorities are very clear. I think it's more, how do we finance it? How do we work together? And how do we utilize organizations such as UNDP in working together in this by bringing the various different actors together?
Thanks, Fatma. That's actually a really, really good summary. But David, to build on this, so then the development priorities Fatima tells us is clear. But on the one hand, we have these developmental goals, but the Indian engagement has a lot of commercial objectives. And like Pamela started us off on, this is also the geopolitics is in flux. So then as Indian companies and the Indian government look to deepen their strategic and their economic and their developmental strategies in Africa, how do you think we can go about balancing these?
Great question. In fact, for something which Fatima's mentioned really plays into what I wanted to answer on this particular question. See, when India started it, and incidentally, if you see the concerned department in the Ministry of External Affairs, it's called the Development Partnership Administration. It's not called Aid Africa or Aid the World or anything. It's Development Partnership. So when this development partnership began, the focus, understandably in some ways, was primarily on development infrastructure. Large railway projects, large road projects, power generation, transmission, and that's necessary. You cannot build a manufacturing organization without power. You cannot bring goods to market unless you have communication linkages. So I understand why we did that. The point I would make, however, is that 20 years have passed, a little more, but then I'll make allowance for COVID. So in 20 years, where do we go from here to feed into what Fatma said about using Africa's own natural resources? And there are two ideas I'd like to throw out here as to where I would like this development partnership to go. Let me caution that I'm nobody to make these suggestions. I am today a private citizen. I don't think anybody is going to necessarily listen to me other than the three of you. So let me put this to you. We started with hard infrastructure. I'm using the word hard infrastructure for actual physical bridges, roads, railways, and so on. I think the time has come now, without necessarily stopping hard infrastructure, to also add in soft infrastructure. You would have seen the Nobel Prize the previous year for economics focused on institutions, the latest Nobel also, but not exactly institutions, but somewhere along that line. Why am I emphasizing this? It is not just the hard infrastructure that grows a country. If you take India, for example, one of the most well-known examples in India is the banking system. And if you go back to 1969, I suspect I was the only person in this audience who was alive in 1969, so I can get away with that. But at that time, you had the nationalization of banks. Now, it was a political move. I'm not going into the plus or minus of the politics. That's a different matter. But the impact of that nationalization meant that the banking system moved out from the cities to the semi-urban areas and to the villages where it was not present. Of course, there were mix-ups. Things could have been done better. There have been mishaps, no doubt. But the impact is that the common man in India has access to a branch. Not 100%, not perfect, but if you compare it with just about any country in Africa, the banking reach and the banking outreach is incredibly chalk and cheese. So we need to replicate the banking system. Why can't we encourage the State Bank of India? You have to do it in the public sector because your return on capital is not going to justify it. Why can't we encourage the large public sector banks to go to various parts of Africa and start investing, creating joint ventures or opening banks over there, of course, with the approval of the banking authority? Why don't we do the same thing with financial institutions? In Africa, though you have the continent free trade area, the national market of just about any of the African countries does not lend itself to industrial scale if you want to really manufacture at scale. So you need to export, and to export, you need an export-import bank. I'm sure EXIM Bank would be happy to look at talking with people in Africa or various parts of Africa to help them set up. We've done it in Nigeria, we've done it in Kenya, we've done it in South Africa, we've done it in Zimbabwe. There's one more country I'm not able to recollect right now. I'm sure they would be happy. I can't speak for EXIM anymore, of course, but I'm sure they'd be happy. Similarly, the Bureau of Indian Standards, the Register of Shipping, the Quality Circles, the Confederation of Indian Industry, the Drug Controller General, probably not the best example at the moment, but you get my point. These kind of soft institutions we need to create in various countries in Africa because these soft institutions are much more long-lasting than the physical bridges and roads and all that you do, and they will have a long impact on the economic development. That was the first suggestion. The second suggestion is I would like to move away from projects to investment. You referred to it yourself, Veda, in your speech last week at Harvard. I think it was last week, if I'm not mistaken. I'm going to plead old age if I've got my dates wrong. But you pointed out how a shift is happening from the Indian public sector to the private sector. Now, that is great. But it also needs to be followed up by a shift from the hard infrastructure projects to investment. Let me give you an example, and I'll again go back to history, which is where I'm a prehistorical person. In 1984, again, I suspect I was the only person alive here, you had the Suzuki Motor Corporation of Japan investing into Maruti in India in Gurgaon. Believe it or not, the first year, the installed capacity of that plant, I know because I was working there for Maruti in those days, was literally 20,000 vehicles per annum. Now, put this in the position where the only two other car manufacturers at that time had a combined capacity of less than half of this. People were laughing. They said, look, this is never going to succeed. This is going to fail. Well, today, Suzuki India is the crown in the jewel of Suzuki Japan. A major chunk of the revenues and profits come from there. But the most important thing is, as it's scaled up, today Suzuki India is producing over 1 million vehicles in multiple plants. What did that do? It gave scale for automotive components to grow, for tires, for harnesses. Instead of CKDs coming in from Japan, you now had Indian vendor development, people today the car is almost entirely indigenized. Now, this is something we need to replicate in Africa. Why can we not incentivize Suzuki India to set up in, I mean, whatever suitable country, I don't want to play favorites, and recreate this ecosystem over there, not just to produce cars, but to create an auto components habitat over there, which will then cater to the entire African market. Now, this is in automobiles. We can do this in pharmaceuticals, vaccines. We saw what happened in COVID. Vaccines are not the most friendly goods to ship by sea or by air when you need them urgently, in chemicals, in medicines, and so many. So what I'm trying to say is that let the hard infrastructure projects not stop, but let us look at soft infrastructure and let's encourage investment into Africa. And for that, there are a couple of problems, but let me stop talking here and I'll come back to this later if you give me time.
Absolutely, David. This is something that I really do want to go in depth. But I do want to quickly say, one, there's actually a very interesting history of India helping build institutions in Africa. I often cite this, and I think it's brilliant. Avinash Paliwal has a paper which is about how, the the intelligence agency helped build Ghana's external intelligence agency. So I think this relationship goes back a long way. But these are really, really great policy and very specific recommendations, David. So thank you very much. Also on private sector, I do have follow-up questions, but I'll quickly just jump to Fatma. And Fatma, can you just walk us through a little bit of what Pamela mentioned at the beginning? Because the world is coming to Africa now. It's not just Indian companies, it's not just Chinese companies, it's not just European companies, right? So from your interactions with African governments, what is the expectation from African leaders and African governments from partners like India?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I think before I answer that, what the expectations are from Indian partners, I think I just want to quickly react to David's point, since you encourage interaction.
Sure, of course.
I really liked what David said in terms of like the strengthening institutions. And I think here you gave some really concrete example of how we can do that, right? In the sense of drawing on experiences, technical exchanges. And I think some of this is already starting to emerge. And some of the work that UNDP is doing around digital public infrastructure, the India case model of ADHAV has also been used as a reference. So I think there's a lot that could be done. And, these types of dialogues are very helpful, but I think also having those policy papers and core recommendations that continue that convening, continue those exchanges and connections, I think will be really important, and specifically on investment. So I think it's really, really important, and seeing how we can actually push investments and building on those examples like Suzuki in Africa. In terms of expectations from in India, especially currently in this current context, so I think, and Pamela, you said it very well, not by dependency, but by partnership. And I think this is exactly the expectation of multilateral stakeholders on the African continent, right? And specifically of member states, is to really ensure that, we're moving away from aid dependency and we're seeking partnerships that is built on mutual benefit, right? So how can we do technology transfer? How do we do institutional support? But most importantly, how can we have long-term commitments? I think, David, you said this as well in terms of not one-off silo projects. I think often we see that there's like specific projects that are supported, but this is not going to bring sustainability. We really need to focus on a longer-term commitment and partnership. And this is specifically important in contexts that are also experiencing crisis. We see this often by also traditional development partners. When crises emerge, there's an evacuation, there's a pullback, and there should be an opportunity to continue staying and engaged. We understand that the risks are there, but commitment and partnership works beyond the different contexts. And I think there's a lot to learn. Now, in terms of other unique positions for India, and it started with the framing of this is this premise of equitable and inclusive partnership. And given the various different experiences that India has had, being able to transfer that and being able to contextualize it to the African context, I think would be very important. We talked about manufacturing, that's also one area, on the health system, pharmaceutical, and of course on digital public infrastructure. Specifically, when we also look at a topic that currently has a lot of interest and attention is around, of course, critical minerals, right? How do we also leverage some of the technology and data know-hows in India in terms of geological mapping. How do we transfer that? How do we be able to exchange those principles? And I think what we can also see, what I think what an expectation also would be is avoiding fragmented approach. And I think India already operates by working with multilateral institutions, for instance, through this engagement with NEPAD. But I think one thing that's very key is we have many different strategies, and working with regional institutions, whether it's the African Union, the RECs, as the entry point, we really ensure that we're not having siloed approach. So we're not focusing on an intervention just in Nigeria or just in Rwanda or just in Kenya. We're really scaling it up and seeing it from a regional perspective. So I think the key thing in terms of what can we expect currently, I think there's a great opportunity to continue building on this diplomatic and economical relationship. I think ensuring partnership over patronage, supporting regional integration, whether it's through mechanisms that we have, the AFCFTA, or other technical opportunities as well. And of course, like looking at institutions such as the UNDP and the UN system as a whole, as an entry point to see how can we facilitate those exchanges, where capacity might not be there, how do we institutionalize them through working in these partnership arrangements. One of the core things, and of course I can only draw on the experience on the projects that we do, is a lot of the ways that we work at UNDP is through a collaborative way. So many of our flagship regional engagement that we do is directly with the African Union. So for example, I work on the Africa transition to support inclusive transition. Now, one of the core areas there is that we work with the African Union collectively in a joint facility. So it means to see how do we set our joint priorities? How do we ensure that all of our interventions is aligned with the Agenda 2063 and Agenda 2030? Now, why is the transition context important? Now, it's important because there's really an opportunity when we work together with these institutions to basically support key priorities, whether it's a governance priority, whether it's supporting economic integration, and so forth. So I think for India, and opportunities that we really can build on is to ensure that we're complementing those existing structures and existing frameworks.
Thank you, Fatma. As we approach the 30-minute mark, we are an intimate group today. I do want to let our friends know who are joining us online. At any point, please raise your hand. We'll just let you in and you can ask your questions and get involved in this conversation. I see a lot of friends, but I also see Ambassador Sandeep Sood. So Ambassador, at any point, if you want to raise your hand, please do. We'd be very happy to hear from you as well. Meanwhile, while our friends think of questions, David, when you phrased the last answer, a lot of it was about opportunities for Indian private sector in Africa, right? What are the sectors we should go to? How should we be doing it? And why we should be going. But what are the challenges for private sector? Why hasn't this happened already? And if I could rephrase this question, because we're working with ORDA and NEPAD on this webinar, a lot of the audience for this is African governments, right? So if you could speak to African governments on what are the policy options that they have to put in place to increase private sector investment, again, going back to Fatma's point, what would some of those be? And please don't say that you're nobody to say this, you are somebody, so.
You're good for my ego, Veda, but anyway, I'll say there are two challenges that we need to overcome here. There is a information gap and there is a risk perception problem. Let me address the information gap first because that is easier. India, in many ways, is a bit insular. We don't know enough about what is happening in Africa. If you talk to the average Indian, he's going to refer to Africa. But what do you mean by Africa? It's a huge number of countries with a range in terms of weather, in terms of economic development, in terms of everything. And some of those countries are as stable or more stable than India and economically better off than India. Something that many people in India don't realize. We look on Africa as a monolith. So following from there, the information on what are the opportunities which are available, what are the directions that one needs to go are not readily available. The internet is there, of course, but then the internet is as much of a hindrance as a help at times. So we used to work when I was heading the EXIM Bank, working with various countries in Africa to organize investment promotion seminars. Now, there is a certain level of fatigue with these seminars, but I do believe they are better than nothing because it does bring home to prospective investors that look, these are opportunities. This is the background. This is a stability pattern of the country. This is the law. This is the possibility. This is the various kinds of risk mitigation. The questions that an Indian investor would have can be largely answered. And then, of course, field visits, etc., would have to follow. But the first thing we need to do is address that information gap. And I do believe it's very easy to address that information gap. The second one is a bigger challenge, the risk perception. Now, for the same reason that the average Indian has a monolithic perception of Africa, they also have the same monolithic perception of risk. There are news items about a civil commotion or a coup or maybe an army issue somewhere, and the person reading it probably doesn't know which country. To him, it is Africa. Now, that's wrong and unfair, but it's reality. And we in India particularly find that ironical because that was the same perception in the West about India till maybe around the 90s or 2000s when suddenly Y2K made Indians to be computer experts all over the world, even those of us who barely know how to switch on a computer. So there is a perception we have to battle, and it's always easier to battle reality than to battle perception. So how do we battle this perception? Essentially, an Indian investor is giving you a problem statement saying that I do appreciate that there are investment opportunities for me. However, I am concerned that the safety of my investment is at risk. Forget my return on capital. I may not get a return of capital. And therefore, how can you reassure me that I will get a return of capital and I will get a markets adjusted return on capital? Now, the answer here is very simple. There are risk mitigation measures, but are these measures adequate? Now, I would argue that they are not. If we start from the Indian end, we have the ECGC Limited, the Export Credit Guarantee Corporation, which provides guarantee for overseas investment. Now, the problem here is that the ECGC does not do foreign currency accounting. The guarantee is offered in Indian rupees. The value is locked in at the spot rate of exchange on the day of investment. Now, obviously, if at all you have to invoke a risk cover, you're going to invoke it at least 3 or 5 years in the future. What happens if you're 5 years in the future, the dollar rupee has moved adversely and you're still locked in at the original level? That's not return of capital. That is not risk mitigation. And despite numerous requests from Indian exporters and the EXIM Bank, we've not been able to convince this. Either a separate fund has to be, and I would argue, how's this fund under the EXIM Bank of India? I'm sure it can be done because the EXIM has the foreign currency expertise, which I do appreciate ECGC does not have. Whereas EXIM deals in foreign currency and knows how to manage a forex risk. So I would argue that a fund needs to be set up for this purpose. I do not anticipate major drawals on this funding because the very existence of the fund provides the security which is needed. Additionally, we need to get MIGA more involved. With due respect to MIGA, and perhaps I'm being unfairly critical, the time taken by MIGA to evaluate a project and give a decision needs to be speeded up tremendously. Ideally, I would like offices of MIGA in Africa to be more active as compared to routing everything back to Washington, D.C., but that's one point. There are also, like the African Trade Insurance Agency, there are various regional agencies, the PTA Bank and others. One would like to see them getting more involved and getting the private sector involved. Because if you can mitigate that risk or offer the prospect of even a partial risk mitigation, it can be a force multiplier for investments. But without that, I'm afraid it's a non-starter.
Thank you, David. That's really, really insightful. I really wanted you to go on, but I want to draw on what you've been saying in terms of, what policy tools and incentives would our African governments need to actually put in place to attract these similar ecosystem-based investments, right? But I also want to take you back a little bit in terms of when you spoke about replicating the Suzuki India success. And then Fatima also spoke about the example of the digital public infrastructure. How can Africa ensure that these kinds of industrial and digital ecosystems, when replicated, doesn't just lead to technological transfer, but also real ownership, innovation, and as well as the skills development that is required on the continent? Now, you did say we have 55 countries. you do understand that each one is specific in their own context, in their own development or economic growth. But how then can we draw on some of these? And coming from African Exim Bank, maybe you can also recommend some of the tools or that you think or mechanisms that you have been working on that you think that will work in the African context. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Pamela. You've highlighted a point which is always a worry for an incoming government. Are we being unduly kind to a particular investor, and will we pay a price for that later? That's a risk. I cannot deny it. And unfortunately, it's a risk that one has to take. And we probably have to accept that out of every 100 investments which come in, some of them are going to be, let's say, not ideal. But that's the market. We need to rely on the market to filter these out. What are the safeguards that we can take? I would strongly recommend, the best experience I've seen of countries here is countries in Asia like Japan and South Korea. JETRO in Japan, JBIC, JICA, these are incredible institutions, and they contribute a lot, not just to financing or guarantee, but to creating skills and capability. Inviting representatives of JBIC, JICA, or the Korean equivalent, I'm sorry, the name escapes me right now. Inviting them, I think, would be tremendous, because let's accept that countries like Japan and Korea, while they are certainly mercantile and market-oriented, they have a rule of law, they have a respect for international norms and policies, which not all other countries might necessarily have. I would start with one of them. Rope them in, and again, I can't speak, of course, but I'm sure the governments of Japan and Korea would be happy to look at financial support for an endeavor like this, whereby the policies that would be needed to attract investment, the investment climate, the regulations, the various components which go to attracting investment in, could be drafted out by these and submitted to the national parliaments of various countries in Africa for approval. You could even have investment promotion agencies with experts seconded from these countries, seconded from India and other countries as well, who could use their practical experience to shorten the learning curve where Africa is concerned. I'm specifically recommending Asia because I believe the linkages in terms of community, in terms of understanding and culture between Asia and Africa are more amenable to the joint development as compared to Africa and the West. Perhaps there's some self-interest there also, I can't deny it, but I do believe that would be the best way.
Thank you, David. I think that was so concrete in terms of, what reforms could work effectively in the continent, especially leveraging on the domestic capital that you're speaking about, but more importantly, what makes them more attractive for long-term private investment. Fatma, I want to turn to you when, you also explained the work that UNDP does. Are there any innovative financing models or partnership, engagements that UNDP has seen, it succeed recently in the African continent? And how do you think, if these are, one or two success stories, how do you think that these can be scaled up continent-wide?
No, thank you so much. And really interesting listening to David as well, because I think a lot of these discussions, when we talk about investments in Africa, everybody speaks of risks. And you said it when we talk about the stories of Africa, a lot of the perception is also very outdated. So I think moving away that is monolithic, and understanding that each context is very different. So I think coming to your point around, what are some of the programs that we're doing at UNDP and that's successful? I think the first thing is to ensure that the governance environment is supported. So of course, as a development organizations, our primary focus at UNDP is definitely to support governance, because of course you can't divorce a governance, development, investment. You need the enabling environment to be there for investments to come in, for there to be de-risk, for people to understand the context that they're operating in. And there's a couple of initiatives that UNDP have, of course, worked very closely with the African Union. One of the new initiatives as well that the UNDP has been working with, the African peer review mechanism, has also been around credit ratings. So UNDP is working with APRM to establish an African credit rating agency. And this is an instrumental initiative in shaping Africa's financial ecosystem and the global rating industry. So these are the type of initiatives that are being supported. I think also a big element, and again, being able to learn from India as well, is a work around digitization, right? So there's across the African countries, when we talk about, understanding our population, understanding the trends, understanding how opportunities emerge, a key part is also ensuring that we're working across the country. So one of the other initiatives that we have also ensured that we've been working in is that as the continent, a lot of focus has also been on the capitals. Now, we need to move away from just the capitals and also work around the peripheries. And one of the core initiatives that we had been supporting is around the African Borderland Center. And specifically ensuring that those communities who live in borderline communities who are moving across borders are supported. So, ensuring that cross-border operations, ensuring to understand the needs of those communities, but also what innovations are coming out from those communities. From the work that UNDP African Borderland Center was doing was a lot in supporting these borderline communities and seeing the innovations that are coming out. So how are people already trading? How are they already communicating? So I think that there's a lot that we can learn from the African population itself, and I think by amplifying some of these stories, amplifying these success opportunities, whether it's the diaspora who are investing into the continent, and where are they investing, and how are they doing so outside of formal structures, I think we can learn a lot from that. So I think the clear takeaway here is that a lot is being done, and I think that there are a lot of success stories, but we need to shift in the perception that sometimes may exist around, the continent in terms of the risk, because the bad news always spread, right? Oh, there's been a coup in these countries, and people translate that to mean that it's happening across the continent. How do we amplify the success stories that are happening on the continent, the initiatives that are working, so that we can drive more investments? And across the UNDP, we're working across planet, governance, prosperity, whether it's supporting the AFCFTA, whether it's supporting initiatives on credit rating. I think there's a lot is positive that can be built upon. And I think we need to just continue having these exchanges, like David said, how do we foster more South-South cooperation? How do we have more practical, technical sessions on scaling up those initiatives that work? But yeah, so there's a lot of concrete opportunities that we have been doing, and it's mostly share those success stories more broadly across the continent, but also across different regions.
Thanks, Fatma. I can hear risk governance, I can hear also political will if we want to drive this across the continent. So thank you for that. David, last question for me, very curious to know this. In terms of considering Africa's current, continental frameworks, like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the AU's institutional reform agenda, where do you see the greatest potential for synergy between India as institutional expertise and Africa's drive for economic integration? You've said many things, but I still want to zone in that if you think that there was one model that you found that in your areas of expertise in the financial sector that can work, because from the context where I sit, we only hear financing gaps, and more as the time moves, those figures get higher and higher, and that even the SDGs are unattainable because of these financing gaps. So if you could just give me some insights coming from that financial background. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, ma'am. I'll probably stick to finance because that's the area I know best. And I would say we need to develop the banking system in each of the African countries. Why? Because it's only when you can mobilize domestic savings that you can generate investments. Otherwise, all you're going to arrive at is a huge current account deficit, which will not be sustainable in the long run. If you want to be able to persuade foreigners to invest in our countries, then we in that country have to be willing to invest ourselves. And the way to do that is mobilizing savings. What happened in India is effectively mobilizing savings from every corner. And when we started out, you had the very simplistic equation of savings equal to investment, because savings meant a savings bank deposit or a recurring deposit, and that was investment. There was no other opportunity. But as the banking system acquired scale, as the stock markets grew, oh, by the way, stock markets is another of the institutions I wanted to recommend. India is way ahead in terms of dematerialization of stocks, in terms of trading. I mean, I was with my wife at the doctor this morning on a visit, and sitting there, I was able to buy and sell a bond while sitting in my doctor's office, make the payment, get it in my demat account, and I was just using my phone. There are very few countries, I think, where you can do things like this in the emerging markets. The developed markets are a different thing. So there is a lot of areas in which we can work to increase mobilization of savings. If you look at just banks in India, it's a bewildering kind of range. You have payment banks, you have small finance banks, you have the public sector banks, you have the private banks, you have the foreign banks, and I don't know what else is there. But as a result, there is something for everybody. If the foreign banks won't go into the tier 3 cities, that doesn't matter. The small banks and the non-banking financial intermediaries, the small finance banks will. There is basically something for everyone. So even the small saver who has a small appetite and the big saver who has a much larger appetite have somewhere to put their money. Their money is safe. It's not tucked under a pillow somewhere. There is less crime, there's less theft, and there is less assault because of that reason, because your money is safe. And because your money is safe, you then have the leeway to plan for the future. That money then goes into investment. So if I were to ask for one, and it's very difficult to pick one, but being a finance guy, I'll plump for that. Let's get the banking system moving. I don't mean private banks and wealth banks for the rich. I don't mean a small presence of banks in the capital city, but banks spread out in a network across the country. To my mind, that's a force multiplier. I hope I've correctly understood your
No,
question.
yeah, I love that, especially that Africa must carve its own banking systems, right? And we're getting there because we have the Pan-African payment systems that now, one African country can trade with another. So I think that's really, really good. But just again, I can be with you the whole day, I think, to touch on that soft institutional systems in terms, how do you think Africa and India then can co-develop these regulatory standards, in terms of innovative frameworks and making it easier for African industries to scale it up across the continent now with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement? We talk about Global South. Are we actually working together? So this is what I just want to get from you. Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you have a concrete example right now with the Reserve Bank of India. Because of the colonial background, there are Reserve Bank of India advisors in many countries in Africa, people who work with them to help frame monetary policy, to look at banking regulation, the typical central banking functions. So in some ways, you already have a working model. What we need to do is broaden and deepen this model. If you look at the EXIM banks, for example, while we were there at EXIM, I'm sure we're still doing it, but we would welcome teams from the EXIM Bank of Nigeria, for example, or the agencies in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Zimbabwe, to visit us. We would be happy to bear their local expenses, stay with us, sit on our desks, actually participate in credit appraisal and risk evaluation. Certain items would be confidential, of course, but otherwise they would be like any other EXIM Bank staffer, learning on the job, then going back and implementing that learning where they came from. So if the Reserve Bank of India can do it, the EXIM Bank of India can do it, then why can't others? I'm sure the State Bank of India would welcome such. The idea hasn't come up because at the end of the day, let's say a public sector bank in India is focused on India, and they're focused only on their branch correspondent banking network over internationally. They do not have a development focus because they are not development banks. If the government, which is the majority owner, can foster in a development angle in their objectives, because at the end of the day, the CEO has to be given an indication from the government that yes, you can maybe forego a certain element of profit in order to undertake this development activity. Otherwise, he's going to go on a market solution. So when you have the public sector strong in banking, you can have banking do that. When you have the public sector strong in, let's say, core industries, they can do that. So we need to have the requests coming in from the various governments in the African countries to the government of India. Because the government of India needs to know that there is a demand for these services, that these services can be easily provided. Otherwise, the gap is not going to be filled. I hope I'm making sense.
No,
You're making
absolutely.
a
Yeah,
lot of sense.
making a lot of sense. I just
I
want
just
to, before I hand to Vida, I just want to encourage the audience to please post your chats in the box, I mean, the questions in the chat box. This is
yeah.
really, really interesting. So please, I encourage you to do that. Vida, I think you meant to say
No,
something.
I just wanted to build off of what David was just saying. This point of building institution and individual capacity. This is something you hear a lot when you read about India-Africa engagement. So Fatma, UNDP also works a lot on building capabilities, right? So could you maybe share with us again, like if pointed policy recommendations would be great, but like some impactful ways in which you worked with African governments, or UNDP has worked with African governments to strengthen capacity.
No, I think we hear often about, capacity building and supporting institution strengthening and seeing ways to do so. We've done that in many different ways. I think the first and foremost is around building evidence and data. One of the core areas that we do is contribute to, policies. So, for example, we work very, very closely with African regional institutions. We have a plethora of great think tanks on the continent who are shaping knowledge and informing policies on a number of different areas. So through our work, we have been collaborating, with Net for Peace. We've been also collaborating with a number of different think tanks across the continent, whether they're focusing on regional integrations, on peace and security. And I think that's the number one way, is knowledge transfer, ensuring that we have based research where we're speaking to citizens, understanding what the priorities are to really inform those policies. So I think that's number one way. The second way is also through, one of the ways that UNDP also sees is that we very much work collaboratively and accompanying countries and accompanying institutions, right? So it's very much us providing the technical assistance that the country needs and making sure that it's demand driven. So one of the concrete examples that I can provide is one of our two programs. One is around African Young Women's Fellowship Program. Now, we know that the continent has a growing youth population. And one of the areas that we've been specifically focusing on, how do we support young women, young fellows to equip them for leadership, to ensure that we're providing those support. So jointly with the African Union and specifically with the youth division, what we've been doing is having these fellowship programs where we identify brilliant young women from the continent and put them in institutions where they can provide that capacity. So that we're utilizing the capacity that exists on the continent and place them in institutions where they can have an impact and can support those key demand. And why that is also important is that you're building this generation of youth that are supporting policy decisions or are supporting implementation, and whether they stay in these multilateral organizations or they work in other sectors, whether it's the private sector, whether it's in starting their own businesses, what you're seeing is that this built up capacities that could benefit and transform different societies. And we've seen some of these fellows do many great things. Another area that we have been supporting is leadership. We know that, we talk a lot about the various different challenges that we have on the continent, but leadership is also very important. So we have been working on a executive leadership program where we're working directly with different ministries, with different governments, and supporting some of the technical challenges that they may have, and working together on finding those solutions. So I think concretely, to summarize some of the areas that we that really drives our work is one, ensuring that we have these policies and knowledge products that are really informing the ecosystem and understanding and really building on those evidence so that we have more up-to-date understanding of what's going on and specifically from citizens. And then the second is ensuring that we're supporting these capacities within these institutions by utilizing the growing youth populations that we have, and then of course supporting leadership areas. So those are some of the core areas that we would be examples of what we have done.
Thank you, Fatma. I love, Pamela, that we've gotten so many policy recommendations in this webinar. It's just wonderful. So now we're 3 minutes out. If I could ask the both of you just a closing question to, your comments overall, because we've talked about priorities, we've talked about instruments, we've talked about risks and challenges and opportunities. In the short term, let's say in the next 5 years, of all the ideas you brought to the table today, what would you categorize as a success in India-Africa engagement, that we've actually gone to the next level? It's a very broad question. Take from it whatever you'd like. David, if we could start with you. Quick, brief answer.
Can I segue away?
Segue away.
Okay. Something which I wanted to bring out in this thing, because I think most of us in the world are not aware of it. We used to have the Malthusian threat earlier of overpopulation. We had the projections of the Club of Rome and so on. Today, we have the exact opposite problem. Your world population is declining. It's declining in the Americas. The USA is positive only because of net immigration, and we don't know what's going to happen there right now. Asia is declining. Europe is declining. Which is the only continent in the world where population is growing? It's Africa. Your breadbasket of the future, the buyers of your iPhones, of your cars, of your medicines, everything are going to be in Africa. So to my mind, why aren't more people in Africa? What more do we need to do to encourage companies from India or others to go there, except to tell them that your future is in Africa? If anthropologists tell us we all came out of Africa millions of years ago, it's time to go back.
Fatma, please segue away.
I think David said it perfectly. The future is Africa, and there are so many ways to support Africa. One is let's change the way we see the continent. Let's see it from an opportunity lens. Let's amplify what is working, what is successful, and let's work together on also amplifying Africa's global voice, whether it's in the G20, whether it's through the perceptions that citizens have, and let's de-risk some of the de-risk how people see doing business in Africa. Because if the future is Africa, how do we work together to ensure that we are all part of a growing, prosperous Africa?
Wonderful. What an optimistic, upbeat note. And I think with this, we've hit time. So I'd like to close now. And first of all, thank you, David and Fatma, for making the time for coming here. This was so exciting. And we're going to be beaming this across all of our socials, but this was really insightful. So thank you, both of you. And because this is the last episode, I also do want to thank all of the folks behind the scenes that have made the last 10 episodes possible. We've talked about things from digital innovation, agriculture, critical minerals, art. And so we have Mahao, Chepa, Benita, and Linda at Order NEPAD. We have Aruna Bose, Gurmeet Kaur, Manmeet Ahuja, and the foreign policy team broadly in CSEP. And we want to thank the leadership of Order NEPAD and CSEP for seeing this, the idea that Africa is the future. We need to be platforming scholars from across these regions and experts from across these regions to not just share our developmental understanding, but also really try and imagine what this future looks like and the future that we are going to inhabit and sort of help grow look like. So to that end, this has been, for me personally, a wonderful experience. And Pamela, I'm going to give you the last word, but I do want to say you've been a wonderful partner in crime. So Pamela, again, thank you very much for your enthusiasm in this endeavor.
Well, and the thanks goes right back to you, Vida. Thank you so much for pushing and pulling, and you've done a lot of that over the past 10 series. We're most grateful, really anxious to see how all this culminates into our book that we will be launching in Addis Ababa on the 8th and the 9th of December this year. I would love to say that we should really, it's up to us to keep the conversations going. It's up to us to make sure implementation happens in our respective work environment. So really, really, keen to continue this work. And I just look at it, and it might be the end of a 10-part series, but the beginning of a journey that we can now start working together and implementing everything that we have recommended over this past 10 months. Thank you.
Thank you
And
so much,
have a
Pamela, and
wonderful-
thank you for everyone for joining us. Have a very good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks very
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.